Is it good though? I really don't know, and I've been thinking about this for several days now. Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khaw is a horror novella. It's about 5 friends who take a trip to a Japanese mansion. It's a haunted mansion, and they're there because 2 of their friends are getting married, and a particular friend has bought this excursion for them so they can all get together and do a whole bunch of paranormal investigating in this house, because the bride within the friend group, her big dream is that she's always wanted to get married in a haunted house. The legend behind this house is that way back, a long time ago, there was going to be another wedding in this mansion. And on the way to his wedding, the groom died. And the bride, devastated, decides she wants to be buried alive. Below the house, on the property, I forget. But she wants to be buried alive so that she can stay at the house and wait for her husband's spirit to return. And every year hence, someone else, another girl, another woman, has been buried alive at the house in sacrifice so that the bride isn't lonely. Sounds really interesting, but most of that story, at least about the bride and the sacrifices, it's not really relevant. But what I am going to do is talk about what I like about Nothing But Blackened Teeth before I get into what I don't like. I don't know if the traditions of yore are still being passed down to the younger generations, because I am very old, but when I was in kindergarten or first grade, the way they technically taught us to be nice to each other, the results may vary, was through books, but how they taught kindness versus unkindness was you would either give someone a warm fuzzy or a cold prickly. The warm fuzzies being kindness, the cold pricklies being meanness. So I'm going to do my warm fuzzies for Nothing But Blackened Teeth first, and then conclude with my cold pricklies. I loved the writing for the most part. I'm gonna read you the first page so you have a general idea of what you would be in for if you picked up Nothing But Blackened Teeth. How the fuck are you this rich? I took in the old vestibule, the wood ceiling that domed our heads. Time etched itself into the shape and stretch of the Heian mansion, its presence apparent in even the texture of the crumbling dark. It felt profane to see the place like this, without curators to chaperone us, no one to say, do not touch, and be careful. This was old before the word for such things existed. That Philip could finance its desecration, lock, stock, no question, and do so without self-reproach was symptomatic of our fundamental differences. He shrugged, smile cocked like the sure thing that was his whole life. When I first started this book, I was living for how it was written. Just from that first couple of paragraphs, you can tell immediately what you're in for, and also a lot, at least, well, about both characters, about Kat and Philip, from those first couple of paragraphs. And you can tell a lot about what to expect from the rest of this novella. I loved Kat. I wanted to spend way more time with her. I related to her. She's dealing with a lot of mental health related issues. She's sort of fresh out of intense inpatient treatment, and she's coming back into a situation where she feels like she's now completely on the outside of what used to be a much more cohesive friend group. I like an unlikable character. I really don't think Kat's too unlikable. She's not nice though. She's not sweet. She's very acerbic, and I would be friends with her. She probably would not be friends with me, but I would be friends with her. And that's that. I loved what this book does in a very, very small amount of space. For me as a writer, I think it's really impressive how much can be done in very little words to set up a complete character dynamic, multiple character dynamics and relationships, and a really great atmosphere without having to go on and on. And I think this is a really great book to get and read if you're a writer and you're looking to make your own writing more powerful. I loved all the different sorts of characters in this book. There's only one white character, who is Philip. The rest of the characters are non-white and at various different intersections of marginalization. And I sort of enjoyed the bucking of a typical horror trope that is racist, that no one survives but the white characters, that the marginalized characters are the first characters to go. Another big thing I enjoyed, especially in the first half of this book, was all the characters interacting with each other. Because this particular friend group, you know, everybody's in their early 20s, they have really bad boundaries, everybody slept with everybody else, and no one's had very solid conversations about when those relationships stopped, when they started, if they ever ended. And so it's very, like, there's this incestuous, codependent dynamic going on. When the setup was all taking place, I thought I was gonna be in for it. I was just like, yes, this is exactly the type of thing I like. It's about to blow up. All of these people are going to be at each other's throats. I have no idea what's going to happen, but when the supernatural element drops in, if it does, this is gonna be great. The level of engagement that I was at for the first part of this book, I had to stop reading it to go work out, and I was annoyed. I almost blew off working out because I wanted to keep reading this book. That's how engaged I was. What I didn't know was that at the point where I put this book down to go work out, for me, it for the most part fizzled. I am now going to get into my cold pricklies for Nothing But Blackened Teeth. So the writing, this is a very short book. The style, it exhausted me eventually. There's a lot of, it's like ordering a really delicious piece of chocolate fudge cake, but it's one of those cakes where you know it's beautifully made, but just 2 bites and you're done. You can't finish the whole slice. That's how I felt about the style in this book. But there are a few times where I was reading this where I thought that, like, some of it just didn't make sense. Some of it was, I was sort of like, this sounds kind of interesting and nice, but it's actually extremely confusing. The way she structured the dialogue makes understanding what's going on a bit confusing for me. Like, when I was reading these things, I would usually have to stop and read it again, or sometimes go back into the paragraph before to figure out, I was like, who was talking to who was saying what? I don't know. Some of it looks like this. Luckily, Philip, and stretched like a dog, long and lazy, completely unself-conscious, scratched behind his ear, a smile crooking his lips. This isn't Matsue Castle. Philip is speaking, and all he says is, luckily, this isn't Matsue Castle. The luckily, Philip, and stretched like a dog. So luckily, like, there's no Philip said, it's just Philip and stretched like a dog. So Philip is stretching like a dog, long and lazy, completely unself-conscious. He scratched behind his ear, a smile crooking his lips. So The elimination of the said from the dialogue tag and going straight into the action it was very jarring for me. That particular example of odd dialogue structure didn't bother me as much as this type of structure that she also did quite a bit. So I'm going to say what this particular character says just straight through, and then I'm going to read what is actually on the page. Talia says, that's pretty fucking metal. What is on the page is, that's... Talia walked a hand along Faye's arm, a gesture that said, look, you have to understand that this belongs to me. Her eyes found mine, liquid and unkind. In that instant, I wanted badly to tell her again that the past was so sepulchered in poor choices. You couldn't get Faze and me back together for bourbon enough to brine New Orleans, but that wasn't the point. That's pretty fucking metal. There is so much in between the first and second that I completely lose track of who is saying the sentence, what it is in response to, and it completely throws me off. We understand Talia is speaking, then we move into a whole bunch of what Kat is thinking about her. So by the time we get to the final part of the sentence, we've had Talia mentioned, Faze mentioned, Kat mentioned, and then Faze mentioned again, and then finally that's pretty fucking metal. And that happens a number of times. And that one bothered me way more than the prior example, because this one I would be completely lost for. For me, I think that's an example of, even if you write technically very well, how some of this, when you're trying to make it sound interesting, just ends up being confusing. My larger complaints are about the thematic content of the story. What's this story really about? Because for the most part, if you are looking for a scary horror story or a really heavily supernatural haunted house story where there is paranormal investigation going on, and a lot of tension build up with that element, this is not the book for you. What's going on is interesting, and it definitely falls under the umbrella of horror, but it's not that sort of a book. It's very atmospheric, and at the end, there are a couple of sequences of gore that are fairly intense, depending on who you are, but it's also not very scary. Intense spoilers from this moment on. What I expected based on the setup that we get, I was expecting for all the characters to kind of be in various phases of conflict throughout the rest of the novella. I expected for there to be switching sides. I expected for a lot more to fall apart emotionally and psychologically than it did. The big thing about the book is the only character to die is the white guy. The rest of the marginalized characters make it out alive, which that's great. But for what I was given, at first for me, it seemed really simplistic. And also, it wasn't working for me for a couple of reasons. One being that at the beginning of the book, Kat mentions that Philip's demonstration of wealth, his being able to rent this mansion and fly all of them out to Japan first class, is indicative of this huge gap that exists between them. And she is constantly looking at him and thinking a lot of very breathless, romantic, and yet cutting thoughts about him. He's got quarterback shoulders, you know, his jaw and his hair. He's got a politician's smile. He's the golden boy. He's this, he's that. And it happens quite a bit. And in fact, I didn't hate Philip So much as I hated Kat's attention on him, I hated how much of Kat's headspace Philip was manspreading in rent-free. I was mostly thinking throughout this, not that, I super wanted Philip to eat it. I was thinking, God, Kat, could we stop obsessing over Philip for maybe 5 minutes? Because all of the rest of these characters, while they are taking shots at Philip for being, oh, trust fund baby, little rich boy, daddy's money, and a lot of other pejoratives like that, all of these characters are incredibly wealthy. Talia, one of them, is described as having prep school inflections. They all went to school together. And in order to be mixing with someone as wealthy as Philip, you're going to have some kind of wealth yourself. One of their other friends, Lynn, describes his own wedding in which he made everybody fly out to Iceland. And he does not say if he paid for everybody to fly out to Iceland, as Philip has paid for everyone to fly out to Japan. So if everybody can afford a trip to Iceland to stand and participate in a wedding, I don't know, what's that like, right? At the end of the novella, in the epilogue, Kat mentions, she's like, after everything that happened, I needed a do-over. So I decided to go back to school. I decided to go to Oxford University. That's an option. Things have been so hard and messy. You know what? I'm just gonna go to Oxford University. That's on the table for me. And she also does not say if she is on maybe a full scholarship, but it's just the character's level of wealth and wealth demonstrations neuter some of that criticism of Philip, because while Philip is significantly wealthier than them, it's all essentially first world problems. It's 1% problems. So when Philip gets it, it's not as powerful for me within that type of reading of this book. Philip's not necessarily shown as the villain here, and I'm not sure whether that's a positive or a negative, because I like a messy story. I like hey, we're not on the nosing everything, and this white guy is totally bad, while all the poor people of color and marginalized identities are so good and so I like that. But for the way the story is structured, it took out some of the oomph from that big moment, that moment when Philip is finally sacrificed to the house. Sorry about this angle change and about kind of this shaky camera, but I thought about something else that also made a lot of this part of the story fall apart for me. Something that makes some of this privilege dynamic, the commentary about privilege and who has it and who doesn't, how I'm feeling about Philip being sacrificed and the rest of the characters, is that for a lot of the book, the characters of color are discussing how cavalierly Philip has rented this mansion in Japan, and how, this is indicative of, white privilege and class privilege and all of that, which it is. However, they're all there too. They're all doing the exact same thing that he's doing. None of these characters, with the exception of FaZe, who has a Japanese mother, is Japanese. All of them are trespassing on a space that essentially doesn't belong to them. So I thought some of that was going to come in and be something we were dealing with, which was very interesting to me. If there were characters of color dealing with also the ramifications of cultural appropriation. I thought that would have been a very interesting way to take this. It didn't really go that way. And with all of the characters of color just sort of ribbing Philip for this, it just made me go, but you're like, go away. Stop engaging with him. I think that makes the codependency of whiteness versus non-whiteness a little bit stronger. But if we're gonna say that, I'm essentially saying that these characters have no agency. They have no ability to say no to Philip because of why. That was another thing that made the way I felt about this book very murky. It annoyed me intensely that they kept coming at him for, the wealth stuff and for the trespassing on a space that does not belong to them, when they're all the exact same way and doing the exact same thing. And I don't know how much of this is, it's just on another level than where I am, or it's an issue with what the book was trying to say and how that was executed. So I felt for the setup and for the writing and everything else that just having Philip die and just, the trope being flip-flopped, I wanted more than that. I wanted more than what I got. What also made me feel very muddled about where the book ended up is that after Philip is sacrificed and everybody covers for each other, they all stop hanging out. Like, they just drift apart after this. Like, nobody's friends with each other anymore. So when I was thinking about this within the initial reading, I was just like, okay, but like, I guess, like, if it was me, I would, like, we kill the white character, and then with him gone, there's some sort of like healing or catharsis, and that's not really what happens at all. At this point, I had gone from a very strong yes to this whole novella to a pretty big nope. And then when I sat with it for a few days and tried to make this review several times and just flopped, I think what I enjoy better as an interpretation of this book is that thematically, this is a horror story about how whiteness intrudes onto non-whiteness. Because I was annoyed by the amount of page time Philip had. I was annoyed by the amount of time that Kat was thinking about him. And so, yeah, I wanted him to go. And it really made me think, I was like, oh, like, that's it. That's it. It's the horror of not being able to decenter whiteness and, potentially cishet maleness, no matter how hard you try. So I liked that. But also, you still end up with a story where for most of it, you're centering a lot of whiteness. And I thought that after Philip being gone and everybody just kind of like fading away from each other, it confused me until I put into context that the only thing that was holding this group of people who were extremely bad for each other together at this point in the story was Philip, and him, working with let's keep the friend group together. Let's everybody play nice. Let's everybody get together and do this trip, and it'll be just like old times. So he's the only one forcing all of these people together. So when we get rid of him, it is actually a good thing that they all go away. There is no more codependency. So the catharsis for me thematically would be the end of the codependency. But for my bland self and what I'm wanting at the moment, while this book made me think quite a bit, and while I find it very valuable, I wouldn't say that I would ever read this again because I very much enjoyed it. I would read it again for the language. I would read it again to see if I changed my mind about anything that I think. For the level of writing that we're at with Cassandra Khaw, it's way more galaxy brain stuff. And so my appreciation of it, you know, might be compromised. I might be a little bit intellectually, perceptually, and experientially challenged here. Maybe if you are a person of color dealing with this kind of stuff, you might get more catharsis out of this. So I would give Nothing But Blackened Teeth a solid meh, unfortunately. If you think what I mentioned about what I think is valuable about this book resonates with you, you should pick it up. And if anything that I've talked about that was a cold prickly actually really inspires you, then you should also pick it up. Because while I didn't enjoy myself, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this book, and I would most certainly try something else by Cassandra Khaw. Go pick up Nothing But Blackened Teeth. If you're in between books and you just want something really, really quick without too much like I'm too scared to go to sleep, but I've got some like really good hits of gore at the end, this is gonna be the book for you. Have a good one, y'all.